Today I'm looking at a fairly common question that I get, and that's how to set up expert advisors to only trade inside specified time ranges. I'm going to be looking at the aspects of this. So there is the how does the end user enter those time ranges, and I've got three different options for that, and I'll be addressing the good and the bad of each of those three options. I'm going to be looking at how you can validate those times entered to make sure they are valid times, and I'm going to be showing how you can test the time when your expert advisor is running to make sure that you are inside that time range before you execute any trades. And I'll also be addressing the situation where the time range may span midnight. So where the start time is before midnight and the finish time is after midnight. Now to do this, I'll be using the Metatrader 5 editor, but all of the code that I'm writing, except for the header of the Metatrader 5 expert advisor, is common to Metatrader 4 and Metatrader 5. So you can use this code in either. The expert that I'm using to test this doesn't actually do any trading. All I'm doing is going into the onTick function and testing if the time is inside the range or not. So there is no trading involved in this expert advisor. It's just to demonstrate how to use those time ranges. So let's jump straight into the code now and see how that would work. Now, here I already have my expert advisor on screen. It's called timed trading, timetrading.mq5. The properties are all the same between Metatrader 4 and 5, but in Metatrader 4 you would add the hash property strict here. And so far I just have the onInit, onDinit, and onTick. But there's no code in these so far, they're just placeholders. Now I said that I'd be showing different techniques for entering the time range. So what I'm going to do first is set up an enum that I can use as an input to let you select which method you're going to be using to input the times for the range. So these are the three methods I'm going to be using. I'm going to be either entering a date time, entering an integer, or entering a string. So I'm using that enum here as an input time option so that you can select whether you want to use the date time, the integer, or the string method, because I'm going to be having all of the inputs here at one time. And my default here is the time option date time. Now I'll just cover the one option before I go further. The obvious choice for a time range might be to use a date time variable. After all, it does store a date and a time. And so I've set up option number one here as input date time, input start date time, and input finish date time. And I've specified the start time as 10:00:00. I'm not going to be using seconds in this time range. I'm only going to be using minutes, but I'm just entering that to complete the time format. When I compile this, I will get a warning because this date doesn't include an actual date. There will be a default date attached to this, and it will be the date of the compile of this application. But this is perfectly valid syntax. It's just a warning that will come up. So I'm saying by default, I'm going to be running this from 10 until 20. And this option does have some advantages and some disadvantages. Let me compile this. I think I should be able to compile that. Yes, so I get the warnings here for invalid date, but they're only warnings. And now if I go to Metatrader 5, I can run this and show what I see are the good and the bad features of that. So here's my timed trading expert. It doesn't do anything yet. All I have are the inputs. If I drag that onto the chart and go to the input, here is the time option, which my default is date time at the moment. It doesn't really matter because I'm not doing anything further. I'm just capturing the inputs. But let's start with the start date time and finish date time, and I'll start with the bad aspects of this because it's obvious to begin with. Although I've only specified a time as the default value for this input, you can see that there is also a date component here. And if I go to edit this, I get a nice little drop down, but the drop down is only for the date. And I find that that's confusing for an end user. They're trying to specify a time range. It should only be times. If you actually want to change this time, and let me just go back into editing, with this drop down there is no way to actually change that time. The times are really just a string. So a lot of the benefit of having a date time here, as in a date time picker, are not relevant when you're simply entering a time range. But I can enter values here. I can go from say 2200 or 2230, and this also includes validation because I can't enter an invalid time. So if I tried to enter say 25 here, you can see that I entered the 2, and then as soon as I typed 5, it decided that was an invalid time, and the 2 has gone, and now I have a 5. So it has inbuilt validation to make sure that the time entered here is a valid time. But if you're not watching that during entry, it's possible to type an incorrect time and not notice, and then it becomes adjusted like this. So the 25 that I typed has become a 5. And the same with minutes. If I tried to type something like 70, I can type the 7, which comes up as 7, but as soon as I type the 0, then the 70 becomes 0. So the good and the bad of the date time format are that you actually get a time that can't be set to an invalid time, but you do have that date component, which just appears a little confusing for an end user. Back in the code, and let's create the inputs now for the second option, which is an integer. And now I'm going to be entering the start hours and minutes separately. So each of these is an integer, hours and minutes, and the same for the finish hours and minutes. And I can also compile that. If I bring that onto the screen, I still don't need to adjust time option because I'm not actually running the application so far, but the start hour, I can't type non-integer values. If I try to type letters, nothing happens. If I try to type something like 15 point, so any decimals don't get entered, but the digits that I typed after the decimal point, so I just typed 15.88 then, those additional digits do get entered. And as you can also see, I can enter a value of 1588, which is a completely invalid hour. So I will need to perform validation. And I can also enter negative numbers, as long as they are integers. So the advantage of the integer is that it gives me a very discrete hour and minute component. I don't need to do any additional work to filter those out from the value. It doesn't have the confusing date component, but it does mean that I can enter any value into the hours and minutes and then have to validate those later. And now the final format is a string. And if I compile that, and now I drag this onto the chart, here I have the start string and finish string. They appear in a nice conventional format because this is the default value that I've entered, 10:00. But being a string, I can type anything I like here, which would be completely invalid. And also, even if I am disciplined enough to only type digits, I can still type invalid digits. So it's possible to enter a completely invalid start and finish time here. So this does need more validation than the other methods, but at the same time it is a more conventional appearance. And so those are the three methods I'm going to be using to enter the start and finish times. And now let's look at how I would validate each of those. I'm going to perform all of the validation here inside onInit, or rather I'm going to be calling functions from onInit. So if the time option, that's this first input here, is time option date time and not validate date time, return init failed. So validate date time is the function I'm going to be using to validate that the date and time entered are correct. And just before I show the validate date time, I'll add 3 global variables here. The first is a Boolean, which I'm just calling use start finish. And that's because I want to give the end user an option to not specify a time range. And that will be set in different ways depending on which of the methods you're entering. But basically, if the start time and the finish time are the same in any of them, then I will assume that you don't want to use the start and finish times. And then I have start minutes and finish minutes, which are both integers. And these are going to be the minutes into the day. So hours plus minutes. And now the validate date time function, as I said, it's impossible to enter a time that is completely invalid. So I don't really need to do a lot of validation. All I'm going to be doing is pulling out that time and setting up the use date time and the start and finish minutes. So I'm simply pulling out the start minutes and the finish minutes, and there is a time 2 minutes function, which I'll also write now. And then the use start finish, as I said, if start minutes are equal to finish minutes, so you specified the same start and finish time, then I'm going to assume you don't want to use this. And now the time 2 minutes function, this one that we're calling here, has to remove the date and then take the hours and the minutes from the remainder of this input and convert that just to minutes. So I'm using an MQL datetime structure, which I'm just calling mTime. The time to struct function will convert the entered time, that's from this function argument. It will convert that time into the structure, and then the structure has an hour and a minute value. So mtime.hour gives me the number of hours, and I just multiply that by 60 and then add mtime.minutes, and that gives me the total number of minutes into the day for that time. So that's all it takes to do the validate date time method. If you're taking the input as a date time, then we know the time must be a valid time, and so there is no validation, really, just conversion of the entered values into the start and finish minutes, and then setting up the use start and finish, and so this always returns true. So with that covered, now let's look at the second option where you might be using the input in integers. So if the input time option this time is time option integer from the enum, and not validate integer, I actually have a different function for validating the integer inputs, and I have a separate function again for validating the strings. Then just return init failed. So now let's write the validate integer function. Now for this, I know that the start hours and finish hours and start and finish minutes must be integers, but I do need to make sure that they are valid integers inside the range that's allowable for hours and minutes. So I've only written the test for the start hours so far, and I'm simply saying if input start hours is less than 0 or input start hours is greater than 23, so just the range of hours in a day. Then I'm just going to print a message and return false. And then I can just repeat that for the start minutes and the finish hours and finish minutes. So the start minutes is just 0 to 59, and then finish hours is 0 to 23, and finish minutes is 0 to 59. And these are the only tests that I need to perform on the integer entry: start hours, minutes, finish minutes. After that, I know I'm going to return true, so all I really need to do is extract the day minutes from those values. So the formula for start minutes and finish minutes is exactly the same as it was for the date time entry, but instead of having extracted those values into a structure, I actually have a value for the start and finish hours and the start and finish minutes. So the calculations are just start hours by 60 plus start minutes. And the use start finish is the same if start minutes is not equal to finish minutes. So if you specify them both the same, then use start finish will be false. And then I just return true, which means that I've validated this, and then we can carry on. And then the final option would be to enter strings. So if the time option is string, then I call the validate string method. Now the first thing I'm going to do in validate string is, if the input start string is empty string and the input finish string is an empty string, then I assume you don't want to use start and finish times, so I just set use start finish to false and return true. I'm returning true because the validate string function has returned a true value, although the use start finish is false. And now at this point I'm going to add even more functions, because the start string and the finish string are just strings that should contain a valid time format. So I'm going to have a single function that will validate each of these. And that function I'm going to be calling validate time string. It is going to take one of these strings, in this case the start string, I've only entered this once so far, and the start minutes. So what it will do is validate that this is a valid time format, and then calculate the number of minutes and return them in this variable. I'll just close this function out. I haven't finished it yet. I'll come back and write the rest of this function in a moment, but I'll write the validate time string function. So there are several things to consider when validating a string that is meant to contain a time format. You can see that I have the input string here. That's a simple time string, and integer with the ampersand, which means that I'm able to return this time minutes because that's entered by reference. First, I'm declaring an array, which I'm calling time parts. So it's a string array. And I'm going to then call string split, passing in that time string. The delimiter is a colon, and that's a single quote, colon, single quote, and splitting that into this time parts variable. The string split will return the number of elements that have been split, where time parts will contain those elements. And I've actually got an error here. I need to put a parenthesis there and there. So I'm saying if string split does not return 2, meaning there were not 2 components separated by a colon, then that's an error and I'll return false. After that, there is still some more validation to be performed on these time parts because so far they could still be strings or completely invalid integers. And again, I'm going to separate that into another sub-function because the hours and minutes have basically the same validation on them. They just cover different ranges of numbers. But just to wrap up this function, I'm declaring an integer variable hours and one for minutes. I'm calling yet another function, string to time integer. I'm passing in the time parts 0, which should be the hours component. And I'm saying that has a range from 0 to 23. And that comes back in this hours variable. And the string to time integer will return false if this is not a valid number. And so if I get not string to time integer, then I just return false from this function. And then I do the same thing for time parts 1, which contains the minutes component, but in this case the range is from 0 to 59. If I get through to this point, then I haven't returned false from either of these, which means that the hours are a valid number from 0 to 23, and the minutes are a valid number from 0 to 59. And then this is the same formula, hours multiplied by 60 plus minutes. And that goes into time minutes, which is here. So that returns the start or the finish time. And then I just return true from this validate time string. And now the string to time integer, and I've separated this out to another function simply because I'm doing it twice. And I don't like to write the same code twice. So the string to time integer function takes an input, which is the text string, which is either the hours or the minutes component. There's an integer value of the minimum value and the maximum value. And then there's an integer value passed by reference with the ampersand here. And that's the value that comes back. And the return value from string to time integer is a Boolean, which indicates whether this text contained a valid number or not. First thing I'm going to do is convert that text to an integer. So value equals casting by int, string to integer, text. I'm casting to int here because string to integer actually returns a long, and this is an integer value, so I'm just having this casting of int. String to integer is an inbuilt function that will take this text string and convert it to an integer value. First test then, if value is less than the minimum or value is greater than the maximum, then I return false because it's an invalid number. But after that, I want to perform some more tests. A string value that contains some numbers and some text will still return a valid string to integer value. In fact, a text value that contains nothing but text will return a 0. So what I want to do is make sure that this text contains nothing but 1 or 2 digits and no additional text values. To do that, I'm declaring another string, test, and I'm using integer to string on the value. So I'm converting that value back to a string. And then because that text may have contained a leading 0, so it could be 06. If the text contains 06, then at this stage, test will just be 6. So I'm saying if the string length of text is greater than the string length of test, then I'm going to pad out this test variable with leading zeros. And I do that by declaring a variable called 0. String init 0 with the length of text minus the length of test, padding out with a character 0, so that's a single quote 0 single quote. So that creates a string called 0 that just contains a series of zeros, and then I reset test to 0 plus test. So now I have leading zeros on that test string. And then the final step is return test is equal to text. So if the value that came in as text is purely an integer with possibly leading zeros, then the value of test at this point will be the same. If the value of text contained any other characters, then these two will be different. So I'll be returning test equals text, which tells me if the input text is just a string of digits or if it contains something else. And that's as deep as we need to go into the functions. Let me go back up. So that takes care of the string to time integer for both of these because I'm specifying different time ranges. And now I'll just finish out the validate string because I have more code to write here. And the additional code is just validating the finish string, input finish string, and putting the value for that into finish minutes. And for both of these, validate time string, I'm simply using print format, start time, the input time is invalid, select a valid time in the format HM. And the same here, but this is finish time. And then the use start finish, I'm calculating that again. So I did have it here that if you entered an empty string for both, then you're not using the start finish. Here I'm checking again if start minutes is not equal to finish minutes, standard test, and return true. So now I've looked at the three validation functions for a date time input, an integer input, and a string input. So that gets me through everything in on init, and we're ready to use the rest of the Expert Advisor. And so the time range tests in the Expert Advisor are going to be done in the onTick function. Normally, in normal use, you would probably just test the inside time range, and if you're not inside the time range, you might simply return. So I've just added this comment. Normally, maybe you would just write if not is inside time range, time current, return. I'm about to write the is inside time range, and that's the thing that will actually test whether the current time is inside the specified range. But since this sample Expert Advisor doesn't actually do any trading, I'm going to be printing some statements to show if we're inside or outside of the range. So these first statements, I'm simply calling that is inside time range and then setting the comment that I'm inside the range or outside the range. Passing time current. I have chosen in this case to always pass in the current time, just in case there's a reason you want to pass something different in there. And then after that, I actually want to print statements in the log showing when we change from one state to the other. And to do that, I've got this static Boolean previous is inside time range, which I'm defaulting to false. And then another Boolean value is inside time range, which is equal to the return value of this is inside time range function. And then I'm comparing that current is inside time range with the previous inside time range. And I'm saying if we're now inside the range and we're not at the last tick, then I'm printing a message to say we've entered the time range. And if we are now not inside the time range and previously were inside the range, I'm printing a message to say we've exited. And so now there really is only one other function to look at, and that's this is inside time range function. The function returns a Boolean, that's simple enough, and it takes an input of date time, which I'm calling here now, and typically you would pass in time current. Now time current is the server time. It's up to you if you want to use the server time or some other time, but right now I'm just using the server time. This function doesn't care if you're using server time or something else, as long as the times entered match the time that you're using. And the first test, of course, if we're not using the start and finish, then I'm just going to return true. So if we're not using start and finish, then this is always inside the time range. In the next statement, I am calculating what I'm calling now minutes, using time to minutes for this entered value now. Time to minutes is the same function we used above, where we enter a date and time, and then it simply calculates the number of hours by 60 and number of minutes. So this tells me how many minutes we are into the day. And now I'm going to return a value depending whether I'm inside the range or not. But I also need to cope with ranges that span midnight. So this first statement here, if start minutes is less than or equal to now minutes, and now minutes is less than finish minutes. Now I'm choosing to say that the finish time is outside the range, the start time is inside the range. So if I go from 0600 to 0700, as soon as 0700 comes along, I'm outside the range. The first part of the return statement then simply says, if now is greater than or equal to start and now is less than finish, then I am inside the range. And then I have this or. So this handles the case where the start is actually less than the finish. So if I'm running from 0600 to 0700. But now I need to cope with the times that span midnight. And in that case, start minutes is greater than finish minutes. So I'm running from, say, 2200 to 0600. So start would be 22 and finish would be 06, or their equivalent in minutes of the day. So where start is greater than finish, I'm spanning midnight. And then I know that I'm inside the range if now is after the start. So now is greater than or equal to start, or now is less than finish. Now just make sure you check all of the parentheses here. That particular parenthesis matches this one, because the simple case where start is less than finish is easy. So this is one statement. And then I begin another statement which encompasses all of this. And inside that I have two more substatements. One to simply test that I'm spanning midnight in the time range, and then another that tells me if now is inside the range. And that finishes that function. And in here you can see why I've converted the time into minutes. If I stored the hours and minutes, then all of these tests would have to compare if now is greater than or equal to the start hour, and if it's equal to the start hour, then I need to compare the minutes, and if it's greater than the start hour, I don't need to worry about the minutes. So rather than have so many compound tests in here, if I simply convert that time to minutes, I don't need to worry about checking the hours and the minutes separately. Now I think that's all correct. Let me just compile. And this is where I went wrong. Although I said at the beginning that this code was common for Metatrader 4 and 5, I can't use the comment statement. I'm not going to bother to fix that. I'm just going to take it out. I still have these statements though where I'm going to be showing if we are entering or leaving the range. And that's fine except for the two warnings for the invalid date. So now let's go over to Metatrader 5 and actually run this and show what happens. Now I can see here my current time. I move this input here. I'm going to be using the date time first, and my current time is 0451. It's going to tick over to 52. So I'm going to change this to 0452 as my start time, and I'll change this to 0453 as the end time, and then say OK. And I'll accelerate the video so that we don't have to wait for that, but then you'll see the messages as we enter and leave those times. And there we can see we entered the time range at 0452 and exited at 0453. I'll change this now to use the integer. The start hour is still 04, and start minutes, I need to give myself enough time for this to happen. I'll make that 55, and I'll exit at 4:56. And again, I'll accelerate the video. So there we've entered the time range at 4:55 and exited at 4:56. One more test. This time I'm going to be using the string method. From 0457, I should be able to make that back in time, to 0458. And there we've got again entered at 4:57 and exited the time range at 4:58. So there I've shown how to do the validation on 3 different input methods of a time range. I've shown that my preference is to convert that time range to absolute minutes from the start of the day, and how to then test if the current time is inside the time range and including spanning midnight. So you should find that useful for most situations where you want to check a time range inside your expert advisor. If you found this useful, please click the like button. And if you want to see more of our videos, then click subscribe. Until next time, thank you for watching.